No one in Bengal in 1943 could explain what was happening. Food grains existed in some districts, yet people were dropping dead on the streets. Rice was being exported out of Bengal while corpses lay piled at railway stations. Ships full of wheat arrived in Indian ports but were redirected elsewhere. Newspapers printed cheerful wartime updates while millions starved within a few miles of government offices. Even British intelligence officers sent from Delhi wrote that the famine does not match the available food data, as if the numbers denied the tragedy happening in front of their own eyes. This is the confusion that continues even today. Was the Great Bengal Famine of 1943 the result of natural causes, cyclones, crop failure, wartime disruption? Or was it the result of decisions taken in London and Delhi under Winston Churchill's wartime cabinet? In this video, we are going to dive into every layer of this tragedy, examine the evidence, analyze official documents, and see whether the famine was a disaster caused by nature or a famine engineered through policy. The story of the Bengal famine begins long before 1943. Bengal had always been a fertile region, known as one of the richest rice-producing areas in the world. Famines occurred in other parts of India across centuries, but Bengal rarely suffered such extreme starvation. The British themselves acknowledged Bengal's agricultural strength. Its rivers, fertile deltas, and monsoon patterns made it one of the empire's most valuable territories. So the first major question is clear. How did one of the world's most fertile provinces suddenly run out of food so completely? Historians often mention the cyclone that hit Bengal in 1942. It damaged crops in some coastal districts, but official agricultural reports from the time noted that overall rice production fell only about 5%, not enough to trigger a famine of such scale. Even the Famine Inquiry Commission of 1945, which was managed by the British themselves, admitted that the cyclone alone could not have caused such devastation. Something else was happening. And that something else begins with the war. When World War II reached Asia, the British saw India not as a country to protect, but as a military base. After the Japanese conquered Burma in 1942, the British panicked and introduced a new wartime strategy, the scorched earth policy. The idea was simple: destroy anything the Japanese could use if they invaded Bengal. For the British, this meant removing boats from Bengal's coastal regions, seizing rice stocks, and disrupting rural transport. But this is where things start looking less like defense and more like reckless economic violence. Boats were Bengal's lifeline. Villages were connected through rivers. Farmers moved rice in small boats. Fishermen survived entirely on them. When 66,000 boats were seized or destroyed under British orders, rural Bengal's entire food transportation system collapsed instantly. People had rice in some villages, but no way to move it to markets. The official reasoning was to prevent Japanese forces from using those boats, but many historians now point out a key fact: Japan never reached Bengal. Yet Bengal's ability to move food internally was destroyed forever. Imagine cutting all the roads of a country overnight and then watching markets collapse. That is exactly what happened. At the same time, the British implemented the rice denial policy. Local administrators were ordered to confiscate rice stocks considered surplus, even in regions that were not threatened by invasion. Official telegrams showed district officers pleading with the government to stop these seizures, warning that the removal of rice was creating shortages. Their warnings were ignored. These policies did not just disrupt the market, they crushed it. But economic distortion alone cannot explain the famine. The next piece of the puzzle is even more disturbing: the British wartime priorities. In 1941-43, behind closed doors, Churchill's war cabinet prepared a directive. India must continue exporting food to support British troops and the war effort in the Middle East. Even as Bengal starved, food from India was diverted abroad. Ships carrying wheat and rice arrived in Indian ports, but were redirected to Europe or stockpiled for British use. Several historians have now published letters exchanged between Indian officials and London. showing repeated requests for releasing grain to Bengal and repeated refusals. One such document, discovered by historian Madhusri Mukherjee, shows Churchill writing that any shipment of grain to India would reduce stocks for England, and that the famine was India's own fault for breeding like rabbits. This sentence alone has created decades of debate. Was Churchill simply insensitive, or did he knowingly let the famine continue? But to understand this evidence fairly, we must examine the other side too. Some scholars argue that Britain was itself struggling during the war, facing submarine attacks in the Atlantic and food shortages at home. They say the famous telegrams reflect Churchill's frustration with logistics, not intentional cruelty. They also argue that British officers in India were overwhelmed, unprepared, and reacting to an unprecedented crisis, not deliberately engineering starvation. So we must be careful. It is easy to blame one person, but the truth is usually more complex. Let's return to Bengal in 1943. As the crisis grew, prices started rising sharply. Rice dealers hoarded stocks, expecting shortages. The government, instead of stabilizing the market, issued contradictory orders, first controlling prices, then removing controls, then reinstating them again. This chaos allowed black markets to flourish. Rice that once cost 6 rupees per mon shot up to 100 rupees. Ordinary families could no longer afford food, even when it existed. By mid-1943, famine deaths were being reported in Calcutta. Photographs from that period, often too horrific to show, captured mothers carrying the bodies of children in search of medical help. Journalists like Ian Stevens of The Statesman began reporting the truth in his newspaper, going against government censorship. His editorials shocked the world. Yet even then, the British government insisted the crisis was exaggerated. And here lies another controversial detail. Bengal was never completely out of food. Multiple district-level reports recorded surplus grain in several areas. The problem was distribution, price inflation, and the removal of transportation infrastructure. As one British officer wrote in a confidential memo, "There is not a shortage of grain in Bengal. There is a shortage of policy and administration," but even these memos remained hidden until the war ended. Meanwhile, the Indian population tried to survive through community kitchens, volunteer groups, and charity organizations, but the scale was too vast. Bodies were found on roads, in boats, near markets, and even in front of hospitals. Many people were buried in mass graves without names. Conservative estimates put the death toll at around 3 million, but some historians believe the real number was even higher. This brings us to perhaps the most misunderstood part of the famine: the British refusal to import grain from abroad. Australia had surplus wheat. Canada offered help. Even Roosevelt's America suggested releasing food shipments to Bengal. But the British War Cabinet consistently declined these offers, arguing that ships could not be spared. Declassified documents later showed that ships were available, but they were allocated to export rice from India instead of importing it. To add to this, Churchill's private secretary recorded him saying, "The famine is Indians' fault for not regulating their population." These comments do not by themselves prove deliberate starvation policy, but they reveal a mindset that saw Indian deaths as less urgent than British needs. By late 1943, the famine had reached its peak. Villagers walked 50 or even 100 kilometers to Calcutta, hoping to find food relief. Many died on the sidewalks before receiving a single meal. Train stations reported daily deaths. British soldiers stationed in Calcutta wrote letters home describing scenes that no human should witness. And yet, even at this point, the British government refused to declare a national emergency. Was this negligence? Was it racism? Was it wartime pressure? Or was it the price Bengal paid for being part of an empire at war? By early 1944, the famine had exposed something far bigger than a food shortage. It exposed the fragility of an empire that controlled millions of lives but could not or would not protect them in their worst moment. To understand the deeper layers, we must now look at the 3 major forces that shaped the catastrophe: economic policies, political decisions, and the wartime global context. Let us start with something many history textbooks only mention briefly: the boom of Calcutta. While millions starved in rural Bengal, Calcutta, then the commercial capital, experienced a strange wartime economic explosion. The British military poured money into the city to support the war against Japan. Soldiers, officers, and wartime contractors had high purchasing power. Prices rose rapidly. This demand pulled rice and wheat into Calcutta from surrounding villages, draining rural markets. Traders followed profit, not need. In effect, war-driven inflation sucked Bengal's food into the city, leaving the countryside empty. This phenomenon, documented by economist Amartya Sen, shows that the famine was not about total food collapse. Bengal had food, but about access. Food flowed to those who could pay, leaving the poor to die. At the same time, British policies created what historians call an information famine. District officers wrote warnings as early as late 1942, predicting shortages. But higher administrators, trying to avoid panic and maintain wartime morale, downplayed the crisis. When early signs were ignored, the province lost its chance to prevent the famine through rationing or imports. By the time the truth reached Delhi and London, it was too late. Now let's talk about the most controversial part: Churchill's war cabinet. The central question is not whether Churchill hated Indians. His statements already show a clear racial prejudice. The real question is, did those prejudices translate into harmful policy? Several historians argue yes. They point to the repeated refusal to send food to Bengal. For example, in mid-1943, the Viceroy of India, Lord Linlithgow, requested 1 million tons of wheat. He received almost nothing. Leo Emery, the Secretary of State for India, wrote in his diary that Churchill's attitude toward India was negligent, hostile, and contemptuous. A British official in the India office, Sir Archibald Wavell, who later became Viceroy, stated that London showed a complete lack of interest in the crisis. But defenders of Churchill argue something else. They say Britain was fighting for survival. German submarines were sinking Allied ships. Britain itself was under rationing. Shipping was limited. And large shipments to India were risky due to the Japanese naval threat. So which explanation is true? The truth seems to lie somewhere in between. The British were strained by war, but they still made decisions that worsened Bengal's condition dramatically. Documents show that even when shipping was available, the war cabinet prioritized stockpiling grains for future European operations rather than sending food to India. Australia had millions of tons of wheat ready for export, but British officials refused to release ships for it. Even more shocking, while India faced famine, the British exported rice from Bengal to build reserves for Ceylon, Sri Lanka, and the Middle East. Those regions were important for military supply lines, but the cost was paid by Bengal's civilians. This is where the debate truly sharpens. Was this strategic wartime prioritization, or deliberate neglect of Indian lives? Let's put it plainly. London saw India as a resource center in wartime. Food, soldiers, raw materials, everything flowed outward. Relief was not a priority because Indian lives were not seen as strategically essential. This may not have been a cold written policy, but it was certainly the operational mindset. Meanwhile, the situation inside Bengal kept deteriorating. Starving people flooded Calcutta, where the government set up relief kitchens far too late. Many died waiting in queues. Hospitals overflowed with patients suffering from malnutrition, cholera, and dysentery. Entire families vanished. Villages emptied. Rural Bengal became a silent graveyard. Yet, ironically, 1944 brought good news. The harvest was strong. Food became available again. Prices slowly fell. Starvation deaths reduced, but the human cost was irreversible. The economic damage, social collapse, and psychological trauma would haunt Bengal for generations. Now let's examine the part often forgotten: the political aftermath. The famine played a huge role in weakening British authority. Millions of Indians saw the empire not as a protector, but as a force that failed them or abandoned them. The Indian National Congress, though imprisoned during most of the crisis, used this issue to demand complete independence, arguing that India could not rely on an empire to safeguard its people. Subhas Chandra Bose used the famine as evidence of British cruelty in his broadcasts, strengthening the INA movement. Even many moderate Indians, who once trusted the British system, turned against it after seeing the devastation. In London, Wavell, who replaced Linlithgow as viceroy, openly criticized Churchill's policies. He organized relief more aggressively and wrote in his diary that the famine was one of the greatest failures of British rule. After the war, when the Labour Party came to power in Britain, several officials admitted, indirectly, that the Bengal tragedy had shaken the foundations of the empire. The empire had claimed to bring stability, peace, and governance, but the famine showed the opposite. This brings us to our final question. Was the Bengal famine a natural disaster, a wartime accident, or a result of British policy? The answer is layered. Nature played a role. The cyclone and fungus outbreak damaged some crops. Transport was disrupted by war. Panic inflation worsened shortages. But nature alone cannot explain millions of deaths, especially when official food records show that Bengal had more grain in 1943 than in some non-famine years. War played a role. Britain's fear of Japanese invasion led to boat seizures and resource diversion. Shipping constraints created real logistical challenges. But again, war does not explain why available ships were withheld, why food exports continued, or why price controls were not imposed earlier. Policy played the biggest role. Disorganized administration, denial of early warnings, refusal of imports, boat destruction, and market mismanagement were all human decisions. They were made in London and Delhi, often with incomplete information, racial prejudice, or wartime tunnel vision. So the famine was not a simple natural disaster. It was not an intentional genocide either. It was a tragedy created by a combination of bureaucratic inertia, wartime priorities, imperial attitudes, and policy failures that cost millions of lives. That is why modern historians call it a man-made famine with natural triggers, a policy disaster amplified by war, or simply the famine the empire could have prevented. In the end, the Great Bengal Famine stands as one of the darkest chapters of British rule in India, not because nature struck, but because when millions cried for help, the empire looked the other way. And perhaps the most painful truth is this: the famine did not just kill people, it killed trust. Trust in a system, trust in an empire, trust in a promise of protection. This loss of trust became one of the most powerful forces driving India's final push for independence.